$20,000 in the bank doesn't sound like wealth. It's not a down payment in Toronto. It's not early retirement. It's not even a year of rent in most Canadian cities. But here's what the data actually shows. The moment your savings cross $20,000, you're no longer part of the financial class that most Canadians belong to. You've crossed a line that nearly 2/3 of your coworkers, neighbors, and friends haven't crossed, probably won't this year. And that line changes more than your balance. It changes how money behaves around you. In 2025, H&R Block Canada released a survey that put a specific number on something most of us already feel. 85% of Canadians now describe themselves as living paycheck to paycheck. That's up from 60% just 1 year earlier. On top of that, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada has found that a large share of Canadians couldn't come up with $2,000 for an unexpected expense without going into debt. So when we talk about $20,000 in savings, we're not talking about a small amount. We're talking about 10 times the emergency buffer that most Canadians can't even assemble. That's why this threshold matters, and that's why almost nobody talks about what actually happens when you cross it. Let's start with the baseline. How much is the average Canadian actually saving? According to H&R Block's 2025 research, the average Canadian puts about 7% of their paycheck into savings. The conventional rule of thumb is 20%. Only 18% of Canadians are hitting that number. 25% are saving around 5% of their pay, and 1 in 10 say their paycheck doesn't even cover the basic. Statistics Canada paints a similar picture. In the fourth quarter of 2025, the national household savings rate was 4.4% of disposable income. That's down from 5.2% the quarter before. So if you're a Canadian earning $65,000 a year and you're saving 7%, you're putting away about $4,500 annually. At that rate, $20,000 takes more than 4 years to build. Without interest, without setbacks, without a single emergency. That's the anchor. That's how far $20,000 actually is from zero. Now let's walk through where you actually stand at different savings levels in Canada. If you have $5,000 saved, you're already ahead of a significant portion of Canadians. Statistics Canada's distributional data shows that the least wealthy 40% of Canadian households have an average net worth of just over $85,000. And most of that is tied up in vehicles, equity in a home, or pension entitlements, not cash you can actually touch. Reality check, $5,000 feels small, but for most households, that's already more liquid savings than they could access in a week. At $10,000, you cross a different line. According to the FCAC, this is the threshold where you could handle most common financial emergencies, a furnace repair, a car transmission, a sudden dental bill, without relying on credit. A 2025 H&R Block survey found that 48% of Canadians rely on credit cards rather than savings for large purchases. At $10,000, you no longer have to. This is the reality check that you need. This is the level where financial stress starts to ease. You stop reading your bank balance before you buy groceries. At $20,000, something else happens. You're now outside the group that needs every paycheck to function. You're outside the group that would have to borrow to replace a broken appliance. And this is the part most people miss. You now have enough capital for money to start generating money. Now here's a reality check. This is the tier where your savings stop being a buffer and start being a tool. At $50,000, you've entered a minority. Bank of Montreal's own research has historically found that only about 1 in 5 Canadians has this level of emergency or accessible savings. At this level, you can absorb a job loss, a medical leave, or a major life disruption without falling behind. At $100,000 in liquid savings, you're in roughly the top 10% of Canadian households by accessible wealth. Statistics Canada's 2025 data shows that the top 20% of Canadian households hold about 2/3 of the country's total net worth, but most of that is real estate, not cash. $100,000 in the bank puts you in an even smaller club. Here's where the story gets interesting, and here's where $20,000 does something that $5,000 and $10,000 cannot. At $20,000 held in a competitive Canadian high-interest savings account, we're talking about digital banks like EQ Bank or Save and Financial, with rates that have recently been in the 2.5 to 3% range on standard savings products. Your money starts generating meaningful passive income, roughly $500 to $600 a year. Not life-changing, but consider what it actually is. An extra paycheck generated by nothing but the existence of your savings. And if that $20,000 is sitting inside a TFSA, that interest is completely tax-free. Here's the twist that reframes everything. At $5,000, interest earns you maybe $125 a year. At $10,000, roughly $250. These numbers are too small to notice. They don't change your behavior. At 20,000 for the first time, your savings start to produce enough income to pay a real bill, a phone plan, a hydro bill, a streaming subscription for the entire year. And that changes something psychological. Your money stops being a passive pile you're protecting. It starts being a worker you're employing. That's the tipping point. $20,000 doesn't feel like it should be a milestone. And there's a specific reason why. Canadian social media, Canadian real estate listings, and Canadian lifestyle content are dominated by numbers that make $20,000 feel trivial. The average home price in Canada was around $670,000 in late 2025. Toronto and Vancouver benchmark prices are well over $1 million. Against those numbers, $20,000 feels like almost nothing, but that's a distortion. $20,000 is not meant to buy a house. It's meant to buy you freedom from financial fragility. The other reason it doesn't feel significant is lifestyle inflation. Canadian household consumption rose 3.7% in the third quarter of 2025, outpacing the 2.7% growth in disposable income. When your income goes up, your spending goes up faster. So savings milestones pass without notice, because you're comparing yourself to the lifestyle you're trying to afford, not the baseline you started from. And then there's social comparison. You see someone with a new car, a new condo, a renovated kitchen, and you assume they're doing better than you. But a 2025 Equifax report showed that Canadian consumer debt hit over $2.5 trillion. A lot of the wealth you see isn't wealth, it's leverage. Meanwhile, someone quietly sitting on $20,000 in a high-interest TFSA has no car payment anxiety, no credit card balance, and an income stream they didn't have to work for this month. They just don't post about it. Here's the reframe. Forget the percentage rules. Forget the save 20% of every paycheck advice that assumes you have room in your budget that most Canadians don't have. Aim for $20,000 as a specific concrete goal, not because it's magic, but because it's the tier where three things change at once. 1. You exit the paycheck to paycheck class. You stop being one unexpected bill away from a credit card balance. 2. Your savings start generating an extra paycheck's worth of passive income each year, especially if it's sheltered inside a TFSA. 3. Your relationship with money changes. You stop playing defense. You start making decisions from a position of calm instead of pressure. If you're saving $300 a month, that's roughly 5.5 years to $20,000. If you can push it to $500 a month, it's 3 years and change. If you're starting from a debt position, pay off high-interest debt first, then redirect those payments into the savings goal. $20,000 is not the end of the journey. It's the point where the journey stops being uphill. Most Canadians will never cross that line. Not because they can't, but because nobody ever told them the line existed. If you want more videos breaking down the real numbers behind Canadian wealth, subscribe and we'll keep showing you exactly where the thresholds are, because the middle isn't where you think it is.